She was not chosen randomly. That is the conclusion the FBI profiler reached. Not a suspicion, not a working theory. A conclusion, reached after months of behavioral analysis, forensic review, and the kind of methodical examination of evidence that the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit brings to the cases that resist simple explanation. Not random, and not money. Those two words, not money, carry more weight than they might initially appear to carry. Because in the early days of the Nancy Guthrie investigation, when the facts were still sparse and the theories were still being formed and the Savannah community was trying to make sense of what had happened to a 63-year-old retired nurse who had disappeared from her home on Habersham Street in the middle of a Tuesday night, money was one of the explanations that seemed, at least on the surface, worth considering. Nancy owned her home. She had a retirement income. She had assets that, while not extraordinary, were real and documented and potentially visible to someone who was paying attention. The FBI profiler looked at all of that, looked at the evidence, looked at the 8 months of documented research on the suspect's seized device, looked at the behavioral signature of the crime itself, the preparation, the patience, the level of personal knowledge of the victim that the planning required, looked at the relationship between the suspect and Nancy, and the specific nature of that relationship and what it revealed about the selection process, and concluded, not money. The profiler's conclusion about why Nancy Guthrie was chosen is one of the most carefully worded and, in some ways, most disturbing elements of this entire investigation, because the answer, the real answer, the answer that the behavioral evidence points to, says something about the nature of predatory selection that goes beyond this case. Something that the FBI profiler in the assessment shared with the investigative team and subsequently described through sources familiar with the case, characterized as one of the most important things the public needs to understand about how this kind of crime is actually planned and executed. Nancy was not chosen because of what she had. She was chosen because of who she was. This is the full story of what the FBI profile revealed, what it means, and why the answer to the question of why Nancy Guthrie was chosen is the most important thing about this case that has not yet been fully told. Stay with me. The FBI profiler's assessment begins with Nancy Guthrie. Not with the suspect, not with the evidence, with Nancy. Because the starting point of any behavioral analysis of victim selection is a complete and detailed understanding of the victim, not as a case file, but as a person. The qualities that made her who she was, the patterns that defined her daily life, the characteristics that would have been visible over time to someone observing her from within her community. Nancy was 63 years old. She had lived on Habersham Street in Savannah's Victorian district for 22 years. The house had been hers and Robert's, her husband, who had died 11 years before her disappearance. Nancy had stayed. The house was hers in a way that went beyond the deed. The garden she had built over decades, the neighbors who had become part of the fabric of her daily existence, the wide front porch with the 2 green chairs painted a shade she had spent 3 weekends choosing because she cared about things like that. She cared about the quality of the light in the early evening on her own street. She cared about getting the color right. She had been a licensed practical nurse for 31 years, cardiac unit at Memorial Health University Medical Center. The qualities her former colleagues described when journalists sought them out after her disappearance were consistent and revealing. Patient, present, steady. The kind of person who made frightened people feel safe not through reassurance but through genuine presence. The kind of person who sat with you in the hard moments because that was simply who she was, not because it was required of her. She had retired 18 months before she disappeared. The retirement had not changed her fundamental orientation toward the world. She volunteered at a food pantry twice a week. She was learning Spanish because she had always wanted to, and it was not too late. She was painting watercolors. She had a list of places she wanted to visit. She was, by every account from every person who knew her, a woman who moved through the world with openness and warmth and a genuine interest in the people around her. 2 adult children, Carla and Pooler, who called almost every evening, David in Atlanta once a month. A relationship with both of them that was close and real and uncomplicated. And she lived alone. That detail, that Nancy Guthrie lived alone in a house she had occupied for 22 years, in a neighborhood where her routines were known and her presence was predictable and her life had the warm, steady rhythm of someone who trusted her community, is the detail that the FBI profiler identified as central to understanding her selection. Not the house, not the assets, not the money. The aloneness, the predictability, the trust. The last confirmed normal moment of Nancy's life was a 14-minute phone call with Carla at 9:12 p.m. that Tuesday evening. She talked about her Spanish class. She mentioned the neighbor who had stopped by. She said she was tired and going to bed. She said she loved Carla. She said goodnight. The next morning, 4 calls went unanswered. Carla was at the house by 9:52, door locked, car in the driveway. Inside, the purse, the phone, the reading glasses on the nightstand beside a book left face down, the chamomile tea half full. Nancy was gone. Now, the behavioral analysis of the Nancy Guthrie case began in earnest when the FBI's Savannah field office assumed a leading role in the investigation on day 5. The behavioral analysis unit was involved from that point, not as a separate team working in parallel, but as an integrated component of the investigative process, contributing assessments that shaped the direction of the broader investigation. In the early days, before the device was seized and the search history was pulled and the parking lot footage was found, the behavioral profile was one of the primary tools available to investigators. The physical evidence from the scene was significant, but not yet fully processed. The DNA had been collected, but not yet returned a result. The digital canvas was still being assembled. What the behavioral analysis had from the beginning was the crime itself, the scene, the method, the choices that had been made in the execution of what happened on Habersham Street. And from those choices, the profiler began building an understanding of the person who had made them. The first and most significant behavioral conclusion reached in those early days, before the search history, before the parking lot, before the DNA, was the conclusion about selection. The profiler examined the scene evidence and the circumstances of Nancy's life and concluded, with a confidence that she noted was unusually high for this stage of an investigation, that the victim had not been selected randomly or opportunistically. The evidence for this conclusion was embedded in the crime itself. Random or opportunistic victim selection produces crimes with a particular behavioral signature. They tend to be geographically proximate to where the offender happened to be. They tend to involve targets whose vulnerability was visible in the moment, walking alone late at night, visibly distracted in an isolated location. They tend to show evidence of improvisation, adaptations made in real time to circumstances the offender encountered rather than anticipated, and they tend, in their execution, to reflect the urgency of an impulse rather than the patience of a plan. None of those characteristics were present at Nancy Guthrie's home. The rear entry point had been accessed with practiced precision in the middle of a Tuesday night. Not a moment of opportunity, but a scheduled action. The internet connectivity had been interrupted in advance. Not a response to an obstacle, but the removal of an obstacle that had been identified and planned for. The house had been returned to a surface appearance of normalcy. Not an instinctive response to the scene, but a deliberate procedure. The entire behavioral signature of the crime pointed to someone who had arrived at that house knowing exactly what they would find, knowing exactly what they intended to do, and knowing exactly what steps they needed to take before, during, and after. That level of operational specificity is not consistent with random selection. It is consistent with selection that preceded planning by a significant period of time. Selection that was the first step in a process, not a decision made in the moment. The profiler's early assessment was, this victim was chosen. The question was why. Here, the profiler's examination of victim selection in this case proceeded through several analytical phases, each of which built on the previous one as more evidence became available. The first phase focused on what the selection was not. The profiler looked at the financial dimension of Nancy's life, her home ownership, her retirement income, her assets, and evaluated whether the crime's behavioral signature was consistent with financially motivated targeting. The conclusion was clear. It was not. Financially motivated crimes against isolated elderly individuals have their own behavioral signature. They tend to involve some form of financial access, coercion, fraud, forced transaction. They tend to result in evidence of financial activity in the days and weeks immediately following the crime, and they tend, in their planning, to focus on the financial mechanism rather than the extensive personal research that the evidence in this case documented. 8 months of searches about sedatives and lock mechanisms and internet infrastructure and tidal geography. That is not the research profile of someone motivated by financial gain. That is the research profile of someone whose motivation is something else entirely, not money. The second phase focused on the relationship dimension. The profiler examined the nature of the connection between Nancy and the suspect. 9 years of community acquaintance, shared volunteer activity, a relationship characterized from the outside as friendly and unremarkable, and assessed what role that relationship had played in the selection. The conclusion here was more complex and more disturbing than the financial analysis. The profiler determined that the relationship was not incidental to the selection. It was not the case that Nancy happened to be selected, and the suspect then built a relationship with her. The behavioral evidence pointed toward the opposite. The relationship, or more precisely, a specific set of qualities that Nancy possessed that would have been visible and accessible through that relationship, was itself a factor in why she was selected. What the profiler identified, through behavioral analysis of the crime's characteristics and the documented planning pattern, was a selection process based on what she characterized as target profiling for specific vulnerabilities. Not financial vulnerability, personal vulnerability, relational vulnerability. Nancy lived alone. She had lived alone for 11 years. She was, by every account, a woman of genuine warmth and openness who extended trust to the people in her community. She had deep roots in her neighborhood, 22 years on the same street, in the same house, that made her life predictable and her presence consistent. She had no reason to be suspicious of familiar faces. She had, through 31 years of nursing and a lifetime of community engagement, built her entire orientation toward the world around openness rather than guardedness. Those qualities, the openness, the trust, the predictability, the aloneness, were not incidental to the selection. They were the selection criteria. During the FBI profiler's full assessment, as it has been described through sources familiar with the investigation, identified a profile of victim selection that the profiler characterized as deliberate and criteria-based. The suspect had not selected Nancy Guthrie because she crossed his path at a vulnerable moment. He had selected her because she met a set of criteria that he had, consciously or unconsciously, identified as important to the success of what he was planning. The criteria, as the behavioral analysis reconstructed them, included the following. Living situation. Nancy lived alone. No partner, no roommate. No one whose presence in the home would complicate the planning or the execution. Her children were close in relationship but not in geography. Carla 40 minutes away, David in Atlanta. No one who would notice an anomaly in real time. No one whose unexpected presence would disrupt the plan. Routine predictability. Nancy's daily life followed patterns that were stable, consistent, and, critically, knowable to someone who shared community spaces with her and paid attention. The morning walk, the food pantry schedule, the evening routine. The predictability of her life reduced the operational uncertainty of the plan. He did not need to guess when she would be home alone at night. He knew. Relational trust. Nancy was a person who trusted the people in her community, who extended warmth and openness as a default, who had no reason, and, based on everything available to her, no basis, for suspicion of someone she had known for 9 years and with whom she had a history of friendly, normal interaction. The trust reduced the risk of alerting her in any of the pre-execution phases. The surveillance visits he made in the days before did not alert her because he was a familiar face in her community. The increased frequency of contact in the weeks before did not alarm her because warmth from a familiar person does not alarm someone who is warm themselves. Isolation structure. Nancy's social network was warm and close in its emotional quality but distributed in its physical geography. Her closest family members were not nearby. Her neighbors were familiar but not intimately monitoring. She had friends and community connections but none of the dense, overlapping physical proximity that creates natural surveillance and natural early warning. The structure of her social world meant that a deviation from normal, an unanswered phone call, a missed morning walk, would be noticed but not immediately, not in time. Physical setting. The house on Habersham Street had specific physical characteristics that the behavioral analysis identified as relevant to the selection. The enclosed rear patio, the layout that allowed approach from the side of the house away from the street, the location of the security cameras and their internet dependency, the characteristics of the neighborhood at night, quiet, residential, low foot traffic in the early morning hours. The profiler's conclusion, stated plainly, was this: the selection of Nancy Guthrie was not random. It was the product of a deliberate assessment of a specific individual against a set of criteria that the suspect had identified over the course of 9 years of community acquaintance and 8 months of active planning. as the conditions most favorable to the successful execution of what he intended to do. Nancy was not a target of opportunity. She was a target of selection, and the process that produced her selection was as methodical, as patient, and as thoroughly researched as everything else about this case. The FBI profiler's assessment was shared with the investigative team and has subsequently been described in general terms by sources familiar with the investigation. The specific language of the profile has not been publicly released. What sources have confirmed is that the profile was consistent with the totality of the forensic and digital evidence assembled over the course of the investigation, that the behavioral analysis reached conclusions independently of the physical evidence that the physical evidence subsequently supported. The suspect, when the full picture of the evidence was assembled, fit the profile the behavioral analysis had generated before his identity was confirmed. The characteristics identified by the profiler, the patience, the methodical research orientation, the capacity for sustained deception within an established relationship, the ability to present a normal social face over a period of years while planning something fundamentally at odds with that face, were all present in the evidence. He had known Nancy for 9 years. For at least 8 months of those 9 years, he had been planning what he planned. For 9 years, the relationship had appeared entirely normal from the outside. From Nancy's perspective, from her family's perspective, from the perspective of everyone who knew them both through their shared community activity, he was simply someone she knew. A familiar, friendly presence in a community she was deeply embedded in. The profiler noted that this sustained maintenance of a normal relational appearance over a planning period of that length is not consistent with impulsive personality. It is consistent with someone who is capable of significant emotional compartmentalization. Someone who can hold two entirely separate orientations simultaneously, the genuine social face and the planning, without the tension between them becoming visible. That capacity, the profiler noted, is the quality that makes this type of predatory selection so difficult to detect and so dangerous. The warning signs that are visible in other types of violence, escalating behavior, expressed anger, visible obsession, are not present. The relationship looks normal because the person making it look normal is specifically motivated to keep it looking normal. The planning is not incidental to the relationship. The relationship is a component of the planning. 9 years of community acquaintance, 8 months of active preparation, 41 minutes of execution, not random, not money, something that the profiler characterized, in the assessment described by sources, as a deeply specific and personal selection process rooted in an assessment of this particular individual's characteristics and circumstances. Nancy Guthrie was chosen because of who she was, how she lived, and how she trusted. From the arrest on day 35, the DNA confirmation on day 41, the federal charges, the not guilty plea, the ongoing searches of the tidal and marsh areas south and southeast of Savannah, Nancy Guthrie still missing, the investigation continuing. The man in custody is 61 years old, 9 years of community acquaintance with Nancy, no criminal record, nothing that would have appeared in any background check, federal charges filed, held without bail, no trial date set. The review of the institutional handling of prior warning information continues at the Department of Justice level. The results of that review have not been publicly disclosed. Carla Guthrie continues to speak publicly. She continues to say the same thing in every statement. She wants Nancy home. Whatever the outcome, she wants her mother home. Each character there are 3 specific lessons from the FBI profiler's assessment in this case that carry direct practical significance for everyone watching this video. The first lesson concerns what the profiler characterized as the invisibility of criteria-based selection. The most dangerous targeting in cases like this does not announce itself. It does not look like stalking in the traditional sense. No visible following, no threatening communications, no behavior that the target or her community would recognize as alarming. It looks like an ordinary relationship because the relationship is being deliberately maintained as a cover for the selection and planning process. The lesson this creates is uncomfortable. The person who represents the greatest risk to you in this category of crime is someone you already know, someone whose presence in your life is normal and unquestioned, someone who, if you describe them to a friend, would generate no concern. There is no checklist that catches this. There is no behavioral red flag that is consistently present. What there is sometimes is an instinct, a sense that something has shifted in a relationship without a visible cause, a feeling that you cannot explain. The profiler noted that in retrospect, In the reviews of these cases after the fact, victims and their families sometimes recall moments of unease that they dismissed because they could not justify them against the visible evidence of normalcy. Trust that unease. Give it more weight than the visible evidence of normalcy, because the visible evidence of normalcy can be manufactured. The second lesson is about the specific vulnerability created by predictable aloneness. Nancy Guthrie was not alone in a way that she or anyone who cared about her would have identified as a safety concern. She had a full social life. She had close family. She had neighbors who knew her. She had a community. But she lived alone, in a house with predictable access patterns, with a daily routine that was consistent and knowable. The combination of genuine social connectedness and physical aloneness is extremely common. It describes millions of people, many of them women living independently in the years after children have grown and partners have been lost. It is not a lifestyle that is inherently dangerous, but it is a lifestyle whose specific characteristics, the predictability, the physical isolation at night, the absence of immediate witnesses, can appear in a selection calculus in the way that the profiler described in this case. The lesson is not to be less alone or less trusting. The lesson is to be specifically practically aware of the predictability of your own physical routines. Who knows what time you come home? Who knows which nights you stay in? Who has access to the pattern of your life in enough detail to plan around it? The answers to those questions matter. The third lesson is the profiler's own. It is the lesson she identified as the most important, the one she said she would want every person who lives alone and trusts their community to understand about cases like this. The qualities that made Nancy Guthrie a target were the same qualities that made her the person everyone who knew her loved. The openness, the warmth, the trust, the genuine care for the people around her. Those qualities are not vulnerabilities to be eliminated. They are what makes a life meaningful. The lesson is not to become someone who does not trust, or does not open, or does not care. The lesson is to hold those qualities alongside a specific, clear-eyed awareness of the environment in which you express them. To be warm and open and trusting in your community, while also being attentive to the people in that community in a way that goes beyond the surface of the relationships you have built. To ask occasionally, not just whether you know someone, but whether you truly know what is happening with them. To notice when something shifts, even when you cannot name what has shifted. Nancy was warm. She was open. She was trusting. She had every reason to be. The profiler's job, and this video's job, is to make sure that the people watching this understand what the evidence in this case revealed about why that trust was targeted. Not so that the warmth goes away, but so that the awareness that should exist alongside it gets the attention it deserves. Samaka Stanis Nancy Guthrie was 63 years old. She had a garden she had tended for 22 years, and porch chairs the right shade of green, and a list with Portugal at the top. She had chamomile tea in the evenings and a book face down on her nightstand. She spent 31 years sitting with frightened people and making sure they felt less alone. She was chosen because of who she was. She deserves to come home. If you have any information related to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance or the ongoing search efforts in Chatham County and surrounding coastal Georgia, please contact the FBI's Savannah Field Office or the Chatham County Sheriff's tip line. Both remain active. Every call matters. Now I want to hear from you. The profiler's conclusion, not random, not money, but a deliberate selection based on specific personal characteristics and relational circumstances. Does that change how you think about your own visibility within the communities you are part of? And do you believe that the full behavioral profile the FBI generated has been publicly disclosed? Or are there elements of the profiler's assessment that investigators are still holding back? Tell me in the comments. This community takes these questions seriously, and your perspective is part of how we understand what the evidence is telling us. If you believe that understanding the full picture, the behavioral science, the selection process, the human cost, and what it means for all of us, is worth your time, then subscribe. Every week we go deep on the cases that demand real answers, not headlines. The evidence examined in full. Hit the like button if this video gave you something to think about. It helps more people find Nancy's story, and Nancy Guthrie's name deserves to be known. We'll see you in the next one.